What's going on, beautiful J4 community? Thank you guys for coming in and joining me for another solo dolo conversation. Historically, J4 conversation focuses on father themes, but here more recently, we've been focusing on biracial identity development, kind of our own journey and story into an identity rooted within Black culture, coming from biracial parents. And I've really been taken aback about the responses and the feedback and some of the commentary, particularly from beautiful biracial folks who are younger than I. I'm born in 1968, and they have a different kind of understandable interpretation of this thing called biracial. So let me say a special shout out to those who recently subscribed. Thank you so much. If you guys are just joining in and this topic has some interest to you, the space of biracialness, the conversation about identity, the growing population, and sort of two or more races. Love for you all to join the community, subscribe, share, like. But a shout out to folks who have been subscribing. Shout out to folks who have been commenting, particularly helping me sort of rethink and reshape my own thought process around this thing called a duality of identity kind of dynamics. All of this sparks off of a recent video that I did with a friend of mine called White Mothers and Their Black Biracial Sons. And, folks even mentioned in the comment kind of the oxymoron dynamic of white mother, biracial, black sons, right? But it was an articulation primarily of myself, but both Gene and I had this born in 1968, born in 1970, having this kind of worldview around biracialness at a time where the population and percentage of biracial kids was very small, very different than today's demographics. So I understand the difference in terms of how people read. But I've always acknowledged the biracialness. Let me say that up front to some of the folks who have rightfully challenged. I've always acknowledged the fact that in my heritage, in my cultural DNA, I have a white European mother who didn't have an American whiteness, but certainly aesthetically appeared white coming from Europe. And I have a Creole father who considers himself a black man, African American man. They met in the early 60s, and I was born in 1968. And this was the byproduct of a military kind of experience, which was common for biracial kids at the time. And so growing up, I didn't have a classification. I couldn't pick two or more races. So my identity was largely in the space of this unique cluster and small gathering of people who had either European, German, Korean, Filipino kind of mothers and black GI enlisted men. And that was very much our small circle around a community of like-minded individuals. So that was my worldview, and out of that, I even to today consider myself a biracial person who identifies racially black, despite the absence of melanin. For those of y'all sort of looking in, but at that point, to me, it was just synonymous. You could take a monolithic friend of mine whose both parents were black, and me in my coming of age process, even though I had two biracial parents, psychologically and how I moved through the world, I considered myself black and also consider myself culturally black. So I'm making a distinction between race and culture as sort of the centerpiece, the center stone of what many beautiful young biracial kids are sort of pushing back on today. So shout out for you guys who joined us on that. We also did a piece around are mixed race people still black? And that's what I'm going to build on today. I offered then a set of criteria for the question to even be legitimate in the inverse about are we at a tipping point where biracial people racially could make an argument for their own racial identity and certainly then can choose based upon their life lived and societal circumstances how they choose to identify culturally. So we're making a distinction here between how one identifies racially, how one identifies culturally. Again, in my generation, racially, black, whether you were biracial or not, today, different era, different kinds of question. And then I sort of addressed, does your biracial child struggle with black authenticity, sort of in perhaps an older way of thinking that biracial kids had this awkward rites of passage into a blackness, and I offer some strategies. But in this conversation, I'm realizing that many biracial kids, for whatever life lives and circumstances, may not be struggling. They may just be outright intentionally choosing not to pathway into a blackness, which had been the historical pathway for people who are black, white, biracial, and that perhaps they're thinking of something different, something entirely new. And so that's what today's conversation is about. The biracial revolution would not be televised, y'all. It would not be televised because it's over here on YouTube. These YouTube streets are popping in the biracial space. We got black folks saying biracial folks racially ain't black. And now we have this new emerging voice, which is refreshing to some extent. It just doesn't square with my generational way of moving into and through biracial spaces into blackness. And so I welcome your comments, your questions in the space. I will acknowledge up front that for someone born in 1968, the question around biracialness is a vastly different question than someone born in 1989, 2002, whatever the case may be. The demographics certainly have changed. And so today I just want to explore and get an understanding, what does it mean to sort of assert oneself while legitimately acknowledging biracialness coming from the love source of parents from two different races historically. The title itself is a play on a 1971 poem by Gil Scott Herron, a masterful intellect, a masterful poet out of New York, I believe. If you ever get a chance, sort of go to Spotify or Alexa, whatever your source of music is, and check out Gil Scott Herron. He was a master orator, sort of a griot of the time. He himself was a biracial kid. In terms of my observation, I don't know his exact historical heritage makeup, but he was a light-skinned cat that sort of certainly leaned in black, and chose to live a life talking about critical issues related to race relations at the turn of the 1960s, particularly in 1971. And like many artists, he did it through the platform of music. He did it through the platform of poetry. So despite what today's ultimate thought processes are from the biracial community, it is undoubtedly beautiful family listening in. I truly appreciate it. I see you, Hybrid Ninja. Salute to you as well, brother. It is undoubtedly that biracial folks leaned all the way into blackness back in the day. From Malcolm himself, El-Haj Malik El-Shabazz, from Julian Bond, from Gil Scott Herron, from Harry Belafonte, from all of the folks who were arguably of mixed race heritage, both here in the U.S., also with a Caribbean connection. There was a time where it was unquestionable that if you were biracial, you didn't even get into the percentage mix. You were racially black and culturally black. But I acknowledge today, beautiful family, that question is different and the answers are certainly different. If you're just now joining us, thank you so much. Please head over there to YouTube and check out the channel, give us a subscribe. And more importantly, if you have any questions or input or disagreements, feel free to throw them in the chat. All right. So the premise is YouTube is chopping, y'all. YouTube is talking. Black folks questioning biracial folks racially as black. Black folks saying y'all not black. Wow. When I first saw some of these videos, I was like, wow, what's going on? The black folks don't want us no more, right? The black folks don't want us no more. And then through some of the commentary that I'm hearing, biracial folks declaring that they are biracial and not racially black. Now, logically, we certainly understand this. We certainly understand it. But in my generation, it was an acknowledgement I'm a biracial kid that identifies as black. And to be honest with you, that was both synonymous racially and culturally. So today, I think the beautiful young people are making a distinction between racial identity and cultural identity. And they're saying we are no longer simply going to just but simply blindly fall into a singular blackness racially. We're going to sort of declare, demand, and assert, perhaps a testament to the love source in the home, mixed parents, that we're not going to, in a monolithic kind of way, simply declare one race. we're going to actually acknowledge a biracialness within our race. And then again, culturally, we become whatever it is that we desire. All right. So I'm going to revisit the dynamic, are biracial kids still black? To simply reverse the question, what would it take? What would it take for the question of a new biracial identity, a racial classification to even make sense? So you can check out the previous video on that for more details, but I'll kind of go through this quick because there's a new added element. There's a new added element. So anytime you're doing research or you're putting out a theory or some kind of concept and you get new information, you got to go back to it and add and revise and tweak. So that's what I'm doing here today. So what would it take to even consider biracial or multiracial a cultural category of its own? All right. Well, the first thing you would have to need to have is a distinctive designation. Beautiful family, in 2000, the U.S. Census revised its racial category, and it went from monolithic representation to Asian, Hispanic, white, black, and so on, to adding in 2 or more races. That was the first time that the country, through the governing document that sort of shapes policy, influences financial distribution, influences legislation, tells a country story as to how people are doing based upon certain kind of variables and indicators. And it tells about the vibrancy, the health, the deficit of the nation across a number of categories, and then stratifies them upon racial, economic lines, and so forth. And so in 2000 was the first time that we had a chance to get a snapshot of how a particular community of people identified themselves as 2 or more races. Now, let me just tell y'all up front, that data is skewed, that data is off, because when I did the US Census in 2000, when I did the US Census in 2010, when I did the US Census in 2020, I saw 2 or more races, but I put black. All right. I put black. I don't know if that was a criminal offense, a misdemeanor, whatever the case may be. But again, in my mindset, I chose black. In fact, there's a data set out there that says of people who are 2 or more races from birth, that's their mixed heritage, 39% of them consider themselves of a monolithic race compared to 61% who identify as biracial. That was 2015. I imagine as those data sets are updated, that it'll increasingly proportionality bend towards people who are identifying with their true birth duplicity status versus just a psychological self-assignment to one racial category. It's just sort of the sign of the times. So it would have to be a distinctive designation, the ability to identify yourself and to tell a story about your unique birth cultural community. That occurred in 2000 through the US Census, and so we have that. One of the commenters on a previous designation said that they are petitioning the government, that they're using social media to assert to have biracialness has its own racial category. I asked him, isn't the US Census data that? I haven't heard back from him just yet, so I'm assuming he's asking for a distinct dynamic assignment of black-white racial identity, right? Because multiracial, biracial are many forms, right? You take all the complexity and profoundness that is culture, and anytime 2 people of 2 different cultures come together, or 2 different races, you then produce a multiracial, biracial child. But I think, as is historically, much of the American narrative is a black-white conversation, problematically, but that's typically where it starts. I think this young man is sort of putting out there into the ether, putting an ideal out there that there ought to be a new designation, something more succinct, something more concise than just 2 or more races, but perhaps a particular designation. I'm imagining black-white. So that would need to be one thing. The other thing too is, do you have significant mass, or just simply a simulation into a predominant culture based upon phenotype and kind of what you aesthetically represent based upon history and law and all that kind of stuff, that you just kind of are sort of immersed or emerged or embraced or beholden or just sort of swallowed up by a dominant black community, that was very easy. That made perfect sense when you were very small percentages of the population. When I was born in 1968, the first data that I came across was 1970, and only 1% of babies at that time were considered biracial or multiracial, just 1%. And those were typically clustered to largely from a military environment. The military typically has been on the forefront, begrudgingly at times, around desegregation and out of traveling the world where GIs were sent to other kinds of countries and communities. They then met folks in those spaces, and the path to go into the city, well, that often turned into romance and excitement and passion and produced babies, as well as marriages. Although we know there's countless mixed kids all throughout the world from GIs visiting and kind of doing their thing there. Another subject. So you would have to have significant mass. So we were at 1970, we were at 1%. Where are we today? Where are we today? In 2010, the second decade after the U.S. Census introduced two or more races, about 3%, roughly 9 million children were identified as biracial, or multiracial, two or more races, about 3% of the population. But still not critical mass just yet, not enough to kind of have a populace that is so large that it doesn't nicely fit into sort of cultural or racial immersion or being swallowed up, right? When you have that many of people, they begin to have opportunities to engage and connect and socialize and have community outside just being among their black relatives, their father's relatives, their mother's relatives, or whatever the case may be. Typically in school settings, sports settings, social settings, they begin to see higher percentages of people who at least phenotypically look like them. In my world, I had about five friends that were of a multiracial, and that was our community. And it didn't mean we were best friends or liked each other, but people tend to congregate or culminate initially based upon sort of race or phenotypically commonalities and similarities, and that's where they begin to explore social interaction and peer growth. For me, that was a very small percentage of people, In 2010, 9 million, growing, although that's still small when you look at the size of the United States. But today, in 2020, it is now 33.8 million, or 10% of the population, which has roughly been a 276% increase over 2010. Now, we are starting to get into significant numbers where the question of something distinctive, you understand you're one identity based on historical, numerical kinds of realities, but as your numbers swell, as your numbers grow and become sort of en masse, hey, the little container that you once fit in is no longer making any sense. There's overflow in that. All right, Hybrid Ninjas, good to see you. Respect to the stream. I agree with your points. I'm 33 and I can provide a unique perspective on this matter. All right, let me know if you want to come in. Just put a Y in there, Ninja, or a yes, and I'll throw the link in, and I'd love to get your perspective. In fact, I'm going to do that anyway. Copy to the clipboard. I'm throwing it in here, Ninja. Come on. All right. So let's see if Ninja comes on in. Let me change up my banner. All right. So while we're looking at that, a way to designate and identify and critical mass. When you were 1% in 1970, you have a certain worldview. That's me. That's what I represent. Okay. When you're born, Hybrid Ninjas, he's 33. He was born 20-some years after me. He has a different perspective. This is also a critical question because we have so many interracial marriages now who are producing mixed race children. Who are they going to become, right? Old frameworks and old paradigm are not going to hold themselves up when you have an identifying factor that you can tell narratives around, and then you also have critical mass. So you have critical mass evidenced by population measures, all right? Now, what is the growth trajectory? will a growing population continue to grow, or will it stable off, right? Well, in terms of miscegenation, two or more people are coming together for love, amorous relationships, and marriage. This was illegal in 17 states in 1967. The Loving case went to the Supreme Court. Supreme Court decides to get somewhat acclimated to a contemporary time and eliminates the illegalness of interracial marriage in 1967. All right. At the time in 1967, only about 3% of marriages were interracial, clustered around states other than the 17. As I talked about before, my father had to pick a state. He chose Illinois to live when he came back with his white European wife, because he couldn't live anywhere. So the military had to assign him specifically to a place where it was legal for marriage. This is my father. He's here right now. I can touch him. And they chose a small Air Force base in Illinois. But only a very small percentage, 3% of the population, was interracial. Today, or 2015, the last data set that I came across, 17% of marriages were interracial. 17% of marriages were interracial. All right. That means there's a growth trajectory. If this thing continues to grow, these beautiful folks get together. As the world comes closer, globalization, moving away from rural centers that are typically homogenous, more and more people are going to college. Colleges are spaces where diversity occurs. People who get degrees typically go work in urban centers. These workspaces are kind of diverse. Social media is just breaking down all kind of rigid racialized barriers, and people are now having a chance to experience the world. They're challenging old stereotypes and concepts around race, and these folks are dating, they're getting together, they're marrying, and they're producing children. So it is very likely that the percentage of interracial kids will continue to grow. All right, continue to grow. All right, I see Fat Cat in here. Fat Cat, I'm gonna bring you up. Now, y'all, this is the Fat Cat. If I could see your face, just to know who, just to make sure we got a legitimacy here. All right, now, y'all, this is J4 Conversations history. We're bringing up a guest who I've not met nor talked to, and we're going to get his thoughts, his impressions around the question of the biracial revolution will not be televised. It's on YouTube. Are we at a tipping point? Are we at a point to where it is time to rethink biracial identity, just automatically connected racially to blackness? And then certainly, is there a possibility for its own declaration of a unique culture unto itself? So y'all, let's bring up Fat Cat. Welcome, Fat Cat. How you doing, brother?
Hey, I'm doing pretty good. Thank you. I appreciate the invite.
Oh, hold on. Let me get my headphones on. Fat Cat, how you doing?
I'm doing great. Thank you. I appreciate the invite.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Fat Cat, are you hybrid ninja or someone?
Yeah. Same cat. I'm just trying to figure out all the logistics to make everything go smooth. Yeah. I'm new to this thing. Yeah.
Well, beautiful, man. Welcome. And I appreciate your, sort of engaging previous videos and for your challenge in some case, and then obviously for some of your supporting messages. So thank you so much, man.
Yeah, I appreciate it. Yeah, I think the thing is as well, just a generational perspective. I think my view on this is definitely unique to your era because, like, in my thought process today, thinking about things, how politics affects the environment. And of course, with the environment, it affects your biology. As a human being, as a species, you adapt to your environment. And of course, politics kind of creates and alters that environment, and molds it to a certain, social order. So, in other words, when you were growing up, I believe you said you were born 69, you're growing up in the 70s, 80s, the whole concept of identity and kind of where you were placed in a box, I believe was a lot different than kind of the things that I'm seeing currently today in this era. It's just my own, personal journey. But like you said, a lot of people who are similar to us in our background are kind of galvanizing towards this. And there is actually a space, in these YouTube streets. They call it the golden sphere. Is kind
golden
of
sphere?
Yeah, the golden sphere.
Okay.
Is the kind of catchphrase of where you'll find similar content creators like yourself, people who are, gathering together with sharing their perspective and their unique experiences and trying to find answers, trying to solve things. The world's very complex.
However, before you enlighten me more on the golden sphere, what is your biracial mix?
Black and white. I think similar to you.
Okay, so your
Yeah.
mother's white, father's black.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, and so to sort of articulate the intergenerational divide, I'm born in '68. You're born what year?
89.
Okay, all right. So whatever the math
Millennial.
is on that, millennial. Okay.
Millennial. 33. Right. Yeah.
Yeah. So an average generation age set is about 25 years, right? So you
Mm-hmm.
literally are representative of a new generation.
Right.
Um,
Right.
a part of my, and I'm open to change in my thought process, but to me, biracial was synonymous racially with black and culturally with black. And trying to find an identity in the vague grayness of biracialness, I sort of aggressively moved towards black spaces to kind of find a home in a community and an identity, right? But that was because my circle and what I observed in the society, which you alluded to, there was very few biracial presenting kids, and there were certainly, in my world, the military world, there was diversity there, but I didn't see niche biracial kind of communities. In your experience, being 33, I think you said, do you see biracial folks in your social circles in abundance?
No, because people are similarly have your experience. In America, obviously North America, it's unique. We're placed in the black box, but other places around the world, like in Brazil, South America, they can kind of get amalgamated into the general culture. Kind of, they can form their own enclaves, and obviously you see this in Africa, South Africa specifically, with the colored category. So
Mhm.
another, geographically, it definitely plays a role. And so yeah, I don't know if that answered your question. I mean,
No,
yeah,
it does. It does. But here in America, you're not seeing. But even despite their identity, are you just seeing more and more mixed presenting, biracial presenting families and kids in your social circle?
yeah, definitely. That's kind of one of the things is I'm seeing it, like you said, with the miscegenation laws and things like that. We were kind of dormant, not as visible, not as prominent. But in
Hmm.
today's society, I believe I told you before as well, when you see the political sphere with, Barack Obama and, Eric Holder, former attorney general, and then you see Kamala Harris. I think some of the people who even have more influence than them in regards is culturally. You see of Colin Kaepernick and some of these Hollywood movie stars, people who kind of have the cultural sphere, even in sports, the sports world with the NBA, the top athletes in the NFL, and etc. They have more of a play of the of the cultural kind of dynamics versus the politics. So I just see a lot more of these individuals, specifically Colin Kaepernick, because he kind of really shook things up on its head. He came out, obviously his stance with the Pledge of Allegiance, kind of defying America, so to speak. But then also he had a Netflix series where he delved into kind of the NFL practices and regarding to race and his childhood, et cetera, et cetera. So I think he's a unique character as kind of or individual, I should say. It's
Right,
kind of
right.
like yeah, it's culturally how things are
Yeah.
shifting.
But would you say culturally they're representing a blackness? Colin, I would think so. Barack,
Definitely, definitely.
Kamala, HBCU. I didn't see the Colin Kaepernick Netflix series, but well, I guess maybe I'm preempting the conversation. I'm not only seeing a an assertion that biracialness ought to not automatically fall into blackness, that it ought to be its own distinctive identity, but I'm also hearing people questioning whether biracial folks ought to just go towards black culturally, right?
Yeah, yeah,
And but in that assessment, wouldn't Colin, Kamala, and Obama actually represent a model of biracial identity leaning towards blackness? And
exactly.
how does that sort of square with what you think young people are thinking about?
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. And then you have another gentleman who's kind of even more ambiguous as he's cultural relevant right now. His name is Pete Davidson. He's a comedian. You have a popular gentleman like that, and then you have the kind of South African transplant on the Daily Show, Trevor
Trevor,
Noah.
right?
So you have interesting situations like that. But there's a whole historical reference for this. When I look at Frederick Douglass and stuff like that, and W.E.B. Du Bois,
Right.
and a lot of other prominent people, Charles Drew, for instance, in Los Angeles, they have the school named after him, Charles Drew, the guy with the American Red Cross blood bank. You have people like him who have always kind of been there, always been here, but we haven't really acknowledged their uniqueness and their position and play in the society. Because like you said, they kind of draw towards more one side with their experience and, their identity, but they also have another element to them as well that, why would they cover that up or hide that, right? That we're unique, essentially. And I think it's time that we kind of promote that and be proud of that and not try to hide one side or the other, because I don't think it does us any good moving forward. So
yeah, I'm kind of playing with the title, pulling off of Gil Scott's "The Revolution Will Not Be Televised: The Black Revolution," and I'm not saying it's at that fervor, but I'm certainly feeling, maybe the golden sphere. I'd like to learn more about that. Is a space, but why do you think that is? Is it just incomplete, untrue to just align all these achievements, Charles Drew and other folks you talked about, to just a blackness? Is that a sort of a disregard or disrespect for perhaps the white lineage in this example? Why is the distinction important?
I think it is because it's kind of unfortunate, when you do have a quote unquote white influence, a European influence in your upbringing, your schools, your socialization, your lineage through one of your parents, to just discredit that, and act like you don't have access to whiteness per se, for whatever it is. But, yeah, I apologize. I lost my train of thought.
No, you're saying, a part of who you are comes from what you are. And to exclusively tell it as a black story, mitigates or doesn't acknowledge the beauty that is the other love source, which in many instances is our white mothers. Not to
exactly.
Yeah. That's beautiful. Maybe this is what you're talking about in terms of the politicalization, right? So you go back 60s, 70s, 80s, right? To be blackness was certainly not to allow for white praise. That was inconsistent. In many cases, you might have interracial baby creation, but not necessarily interracial marriages. And so, like in the case of my example, at 16, I went to live with my dad. So I didn't have the come back home and acknowledge both parents. I was able to just perhaps, in a naive kind of way, just live in a blackness, right? But now, as the numbers are growing, as perhaps children are being raised in multiple, among both their parents, connected to both families and communities, there's perhaps feelings of hypocrisy that doesn't acknowledge their full depth. Plus, you're also getting further and further away from hyper black, white, rigid, racialized kinds of conversations. Maybe that's the political part you were talking about, perhaps.
And it's definitely exploded over the past couple of years. I've noticed personally myself, since 2020, even maybe a little before that, 2019, when I started navigating into more, quote, black spaces. I started to kind of see that. Yeah, man, we could go on, for days, with this kind of subject. We have so much material and things to cover. Like I said, I'm fairly new, discovering the golden sphere, because we have in this space, we have something we call the manosphere, which is male-centered issues, topics, red pill community, etc. Then we have what they call the black manosphere, which is primarily around black men. And we have a phrase that I actually like and use, which is SYSBM, which is Save Yourself, Black Man. That's a common acronym in that space. And so I obviously, I'm black male identified. Obviously, this society will let you know real quick. I've been to Africa, I've been to Ghana, West Africa, and I've been called a white man over there a couple of times. It was very strange. It was very strange. That's the only place that I've ever heard it, being referred to as white, when you're in a majority black nation. But it kind of was, I was like, yeah, you're right. You know what? I am white, but that's partially true, 50%, right? So I can't say I'm not, but, I can't say fully. So it's an interesting position.
So and I appreciate you coming on, and I know you may need to head out, but just a couple more minutes. So save yourself, black man. What is that saying? Save yourself from what?
Oh, okay, interesting that you ask. What it is understanding that in Black America is a matriarchy. It's a female-led community,
Okay.
and I mean, I don't really have the knowledge and expertise base to get into all the details of how this exists, but it's blatant when you look around you. 75+% of Black households are led by women, where women lead the charge. And even in our political realm, you look at most of your political representation are Black women.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, there's a lot that goes into that. Like I said,
Yeah.
I could point you to a couple people, a gentleman by the name of Dr. Tiason Johnson. I
Yeah.
think
No.
he really,
Yeah. I'm very familiar. Very familiar. So I thought I might have had a connection to the interracial piece. But no, I'm very, very familiar with what you're talking about. In fact, I just love to see the folks having conversations around marriage, and hopefully, once you get through the fire and the fervor, it leads to more marriages. 50% divorce rate, 51% of our babies born to single parent homes, which is initially why I got into the conversation, and now have this heightened interest on a younger generation perception around identity. So let me ask you this, and sorry to cut you off there, Hybrid, but the golden sphere, does it just simply advocate for a distinctive racial identity, or
right.
is it moving into the space of a new cultural identity? What's your view?
Both. Yeah, both. Being declaring yourself, having personal autonomy, sovereignty, not
Mhm.
playing the game of being placed in a box. And what kind of drew me to your channel and your discussion you had with one of the other gentlemen here is I really appreciated how you put things into perspective, where you mentioned about being outgrouped or in-grouped and membership access, and how these kind of social tokens can be used and leveraged over you to where
Yeah.
you don't really have a sense of personal autonomy and
Mhm.
sovereignty to make your own decisions. The
Mhm.
society, the power struggles, in society to put you in a box. That's kind of
Mhm.
what I really appreciate your perspective. You're older than me, right?
Mhm. Mhm.
But it's still unique, how you see things, right? Because I believe just in today, moving forward, we're kind of in a different era, different space. Our numbers are drastically growing, where
Yep.
other populations, their numbers are dwindling and decreasing. So they're kind of being absorbed into our influence, so to speak. And so people see that when they see me, they see this power, they see the future, they know our numbers are growing, and they fear that and resent that in a sense. But that's upon me, walking and breathing to establish myself and survive. You know,
Well, no, Hybrid, that's a hell of a statement, man. And it's interesting. I like the power in your voice. And you use the word "our." That's unique language for me, because "our" for me it meant blackness. But I'm hearing your "our" being, this vast growing populace of biracial or multiracial. And for our to have an existence, it has boundaries, it has protocol, it has customs, it has voice, it has research, right?
a
And that
code
is
of conduct.
code of conduct, all that is sort of being out there. And so I'm fascinated by a new language, right? A new identity that's emerging. Because as I playfully talked about before, I just didn't know. I didn't know, right? But you're absolutely right. If you look at the percentage of multiracial kids under 18, which is where your future definers come from, is 44%. 44%. So almost upwards of half of your children in America under 18 are biracial or multiracial, and they're coming out. This is juxtaposed against 1% hybrid. And so, yeah, it's definitely a new time. Before I let you go, is there anything you want to shout out, or you got a channel, or anything you want to promote, or let the folks know about in this space?
Yeah, not really. I just wanted to jump in and drop in, give my 2 cents in, and I'll be back, of course. I appreciate your perspective and what you bring, and I'm here to listen and potentially add, kind of like I did today.
You
But
did.
I'm in a developmental stage, building a channel and networking. Because, like I said, a lot of this is new to me, but this is the time now to speak. I won't be silenced, and that's, like I said, that's kind of your power in your voice, your words. Um, yeah, and so that's what the society will try to do, to silence you. You're irrelevant. You're just a tragic mulatto. People will play you off in your personal experience, minimize you. Same thing people do to other people, they'll do that to you. The society is very hypocritical in a lot of ways, where
Yeah.
populations take advantage of other populations when given the power and authority kind of and leverage to do so. So I'm about personal autonomy and sovereignty and not allowing others to have leverage over me to use me. So
And do
yeah.
you feel alone, or do you feel like there's a community?
Well, yeah, I mean that's the kind of the core thing is finding the tribe, developing the
Right,
community.
right.
I mean, obviously, I have friends and stuff, but just coming to the kind of, I guess you could say, racial realization of where things are today. Just yeah, being able to analyze things, and this is kind of what I like about this talking with someone like you or other folks, reviewing content, is analyzing things and comparing notes, seeing where do we move forward, in a positive way
Mm-hmm.
from where we
Well,
are.
yeah, we have a comment from Peachy Homegrown. It's a friend of mine. She says, "Divide and conquer. This is not new, right? That's my fear, right? If we become something new, what is that saying about blackness, right? I mean, and we can process. I'll do another show on that, but yeah, Peachy represents kind of my generation, right? Where the sovereignty you talked about was in unison with a blackness, but I
Yeah.
understand. We got a little background noise there. I understand the new questions, right? But we're going to go through sort of a new initiative juxtaposed against old paradigms, right? And P.T. Homegrown talks about divide and conquer. You know, if you extrapolate the biracial mixed kid out of the black story, what does that then do to the black story? And what does the new story become? And there's been a certain comfort in shared resistance to whiteness, white supremacy, whatever the case may be, across hues aligned within a blackness. But if there's something new that emerges, I'm very curious as to see what it's about. But yeah, Peachy and beautiful sister she's expressing one of the sentiments that you'll probably encounter as you continue to go forward. But I think it's beautiful, brother. I think it's resilient. I will say you're not alone. At universities are starting to have mixed race critical theory discussions, conferences. I have no doubt that there'll be a major that'll come out of that. You have black studies, white studies, gay studies, women's studies, and I don't think it'll be too long before mixed race studies kind of pop
Now
on the
I'm
scene as well.
curious. Sorry to cut you off. I'm
No,
curious what
no.
you just said. Is there a white studies per se? Or are you talking about medieval European history or?
Yeah, that's the default, right? Well, you don't need a white studies because everything else is white studies. That's a little, that could be
That's
parsed too
convoluted.
much. Yeah,
Yeah,
that's convoluted.
convoluted, because yeah, I mean, it's ethnocentric. Most of these
Hmm.
disciplines, anthropology, geography, et cetera, political science. You're
Hmm.
learning the Roman customs and structure of our legal system and everything.
Hmm.
Yeah, I
But
mean,
but to your point, there are whiteness studies, but not white power, right? It's not let's study and exalt the history of the Confederacy and white supremacy. It's not presented like that. It's more presented as a sense of white examination. I do see some of those in the higher ed landscape. I cut you off, brother. I'm sorry.
oh no, 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 yeah, interesting. I mean, as far as studying the Confederacy or white supremacy, they even have museums like Museum of Tolerance, and you go to the
Sure.
South, they have. So there's plenty of this material. Maybe it's not packaged like at the academic university level, but obviously this information's there
Hmm.
if to study that stuff, so to speak. But yeah,
Hmm.
I was just
Yeah.
curious because I've never seen any discipline labeled like white or European studies. I attended San Diego State University, and of course they had a black or Africana's department, of course.
Hmm. Hmm.
Interesting, interesting, interesting. My general analysis is most black people in America just want to be accepted by whites. And because
Mm.
they see people who are mixed or biracial having a white parent, they see them as having a proximity to whiteness. There is a level of envy and jealousy that is
Mm.
developed. And like I said,
Mm.
especially in the cultural sense today, when you look at these leaders in sports, entertainment, movies, I can give you a whole list and plethora of mulatto, mixed, biracial, whatever you want to call it, characters that are
Hmm.
in the center of the screen,
Hmm.
and there's a lot of black people who feel like we are essentially cloaking their existence, right? Their presence. Uh,
Biracial kids are cloaking white presence, or
no, biracial kids are cloaking black uh, um, presence.
by associating with blackness but presenting more favorably to white.
No, by getting the spotlight in media, in movie roles, in
Oh yeah,
television.
yeah, 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 yeah.
And they're like, well, you're not you're not really black, you're mixed. They need to put a real black there. That's kind of the general analysis that you would see, you know, in
Yeah, yeah,
movies. Yeah.
yeah. That's the pushback from white privilege, sort of biracial kids presenting enough phenotype to represent diversity, ethnic presence, but also having high palatability to the masses. Yeah, there's certainly a nuance there. I think when you hear black folks challenging interracial folks, they're talking about some of that privilege that's assigned to white, that is assigned to light skinned people. The piece about blackness having an adoration of whiteness, yeah, certainly there's elements of that. But I've often found that blackness, both monolithic black and biracial black, is an identity of asserting oneself, right? To sort of understand where they're at, where their beauty is, where their problems are, and then through a collective, increasingly loosening blackness, attempting to improve the condition. At least some folks. Now, all communities and cultures have foolishness and ridiculousness, but in my observation and in my pathway to membership into blackness, the community is seeking to improve its condition. Certainly understands a whiteness, but I haven't seen an ultra obsessiveness with it. Not to say that you're suggesting that, but yeah, some black folks have white adoration, but a good percentage are sort of self-determining. And this nuance of biracial, a newness there, I just wonder how that'll fit. It's unfolding, no doubt. But yeah, just my rumination on that. Peachy homegrown hybrid, you're going to get this. Sister Shannon with love, brother, come home. You're loved within the black community, despite what you may have experienced before.
Yeah, it's a generational thing, brother. You know, that's the
Yeah.
kind of that's why I enjoy, you know, your analysis and what you have to offer. And you see that with most communities, you know, whether it's
Yeah.
black, white,
Yeah.
an Asian, obviously, if they're, you know, from the Asian continent, they come to America, you know, generational thing, you know.
Mm-hmm.
And you even looking at yeah, I mean, all the institutions during the civil rights era, they gave up their institutions to assimilate or
Yep.
try to assimilate and integrate with the
Yep.
dominant society. And it hasn't really done wonders, you know, I guess, you know, because I just see this huge growing number of what we'd call a buffer class, you know,
Mm-hmm.
with
Mm-hmm.
these other populations that are kind of in between the white and black kind of parallel, you know, that'd be like Middle Eastern, Arab, Asian, Hispanic, these
Yeah.
kind of white adjacent groups. They're still classified as a minority, so to speak, but or people of color. They have these broad, ambiguous terms that can mean anybody,
Mm-hmm.
you
Mm-hmm.
know. But there's clearly a division as far as you know, socioeconomic status, wealth building, and you look at
Mm-hmm.
these neighborhoods and how, you know, yeah, I mean, you know, I don't see the economics the way like in your era you probably were so accustomed to seeing black businesses walking down the street. Are you from LA or somewhere? So where
No, I
they
grew
have,
up in West. I grew up in West Coast, and again, military environment, which was relatively diverse.
yeah,
But well, 68, 70, when I was consciously of age, that might have been 75. This was post integration, where many black businesses were suffering economically because of the experiment of integration. But I really like your mind, and what I'd like to, maybe in another show, hybrid, if you're open to it, is I want to explore the why, right? I understand the population growth. I understand the need to outwardly show love for both love sources, mom, dad. I absolutely understand that why hide from the beauty influencers in your life, of all the races. But maybe a better question could be is does a biracial identity movement, is it critiquing blackness, or is it just moving towards something new and inevitable? You understand the distinction in the question?
yeah. What I would put in simpler terms, it's acknowledging your uniqueness and your position,
Mm-hmm.
and it's yeah, because you definitely have a different existence than a lot of people. being ambiguous versus unambiguous. I like those two terms.
Yeah.
When
Yeah.
and there's a gentleman, content creator, who's like, basically, I don't consider you black, you're mixed, because when people see me, he's talking about himself first person. When people see me, they consider me black, but when they see you, they consider you mixed with something, right? So,
Peachy's jumping in here again. Brown paper bag test, colorism.
yeah, I mean, it's shaming language. I understand where she's coming from, so I'm not offended or appalled. It's just she's an older woman and she has a romantic view, but we're in different times now. And a lot of these older people have failed their children. They didn't pass down any resources or businesses, no institutions. They just told them, have faith in God, have faith in Jesus, and you'll be all right. But while these young kids, the unemployment levels are higher than everyone else, Asian Americans, their family passes down businesses. They could work for them. Hispanic men, they have a father in the household. They can work with their father, work with their business. Arab, white, et cetera, et cetera. But you look at African American, black men, like I said, they're raised by these women who tell them just have faith in God and the government and the Democrats. No businesses passed down, no resources. They're starting from scratch every generation. Expected net worth, of the community that is going to be around zero in about 30 years or so. The trajectory of way things look. I don't see any business infrastructure. How are you going to compete out here with these young men who need resources and jobs? Instead, they steal from one another and try to scam their own, And
So, Harvey, what you're saying is, that's consistent with some language and conversations, and in fact, those things we're seeing in other communities. But it goes back to my very point, right? And I invite you to really, think this one through, because I think it'll be critical to your movement, or not. But does a new biracial distinction, does it come at a disdain for blackness, or does it come exclusively out of its time? We're just so unique in now in terms of our collective mass, and we're going forward, right? I hope as it goes forward, it does it in a loving generational handoff to the cultural community that it was once a member of. But if it does it in this, y'all just didn't do it right, and it's time for us to break off. I fear that tension. I fear a racial immersion and birth that comes from an agitated and sort of agitated relationship, essentially, to its cultural mother. And I don't want that to happen. I really don't want that to happen. Last
right,
thought is yours. Last thought is
right,
yours.
right. Yeah, I agree with your analysis. I like the way you phrase that and you put that. You're right. I tend to spew sometimes a little bit of
No, you passionate, brother. I love it.
yeah, you can hear the passion, and
Mm-hmm.
it might come off a little bit assertive and stuff. So, but I agree with what you're saying. As you said, a cultural handoff, not to have any disdain or, towards one side or the other. That's the whole thing, is to come, be at peace, because, yeah, I agree with you on that for sure.
Hey, I appreciate that, y'all. Brother Hybrid Ninja on here, Fat Cat 89, is representing in full spirit the essence of the title, right? The biracial revolution will not be televised. It's on YouTube. Fat Cat just introduced us to a new community called the Golden Sphere. I'm going to research it. Hybrid, please send me some links. My email is in one of those descriptions. I'd love to learn more about the community. I'm not approaching this as a thou shalt not. To me, it's an intergenerational evolution rooted in certain variables that are making the question legitimate. I just absolutely hope it's not done in lieu of, but as we talked about, as a cultural handoff in a
Right.
cultural right. But brother, y'all listening in, Hybrid's representing a new conversation that I think is not going to go away, and quite frankly, needs to be heard. Needs to be heard. Hybrid, you welcome up here anytime, man. You welcome up here anytime, and I appreciate the love that you've shown. And if you think other folks have value, man, send them over here. Let them come check out J4 Conversations, brother.
Yeah, I appreciate it. Thank you for allowing me to come up, and enjoy your day.
You welcome anytime. We'll talk soon. All right. All right, that was wonderful. That was wonderful, y'all. That was my first sort of guest with someone that I had not personally met before and vetted, and so I think it went pretty well. Peachy still on him. We are doomed to repeat history if we don't know our past, right? Peachy, I agree with you absolutely generationally, but I also agree with the young brother, man. He's asking a new question that new generations tend to do, and the numbers are just getting so massive that it just can't be assumed that biracial kids, black, white, biracial kids are just naturally going to fall into the black umbrella as we once did. So good questions. All right, let me just kind of round out my thoughts here, and thank you guys so much. And if someone would like to get in, the post is up there a little bit further. Just come on in, we can chop it up. But I was talking about what would it take to make the question even legit for a biracial identity to assert itself as something new. Well, a designation. U.S. Census 2000 did that. They would have to have significant mass, right? 38 million currently in the United States, which is 10% of the population compared to 1% when I was born. That's there. And will it increase? Interracial marriages in 1967 were 3%. 2015, they were 17%. This thing is going to continue to grow. The other element that would need to be in place is the group study. Can we tell a story about the group? Can we identify what the group is, how it's distinctive as a culture unto itself or as a race unto itself? And if you do any kind of Google Scholar search, there's over 20,000 articles that are telling stories and data and research about biracial communities. So there's certainly an academic scholarship element that's being there that would be necessary. And then finally, and we're saying this, what else would it take? It would actually take a questioning of membership by the dominant group, by the monolithic group. If you seek membership into a monolithic group because of phenotype representation, but that dominant group then starts to reject you, starts to tell you you ain't black, you ain't this, you ain't that, at some point a person only goes where they're welcome and where they feel connected. But if en masse you got black monolithic two-parent black folks challenging biracial kids, hey, they're going to make other decisions, even in absence of something to go to. They will just realize I'm no longer welcome there, therefore I'm something else. And in time, that something else will define itself. Peachy Homegrown says, we'll be all right. We have a bright, positive future, no doubt, sister. And then the last thing, and this is the new thing, not only would it take sort of rejection by the monolithic culture, but it would also take an assertion by the black white racial for a declaration of their own race and eventually culture, right? Before I didn't have that. Before I just assumed to hybrid's dynamic, the absence of autonomy, the absence of sovereignty, that our membership was gatekept by blackness. But now you have a movement, the golden sphere, where interracial kids are actually saying, no, no, even without your rejection, we're of critical mass now. Our scholarship is telling us things. We're going to go assert ourselves into the world. Very interesting, completely outside the scope of my 1968 biracial self. And so I'm very, very interested in where this conversation is going. And so as I close out, if there's any questions or comments, please throw them in the box. I don't want to go past an hour. This has been tremendously insightful and wonderful. I have not had a guest up before, unknown, and I did that first. And so this is a series of firsts. So hey, consider joining us in this J4 Conversations ride in the biracial space on these biracial YouTube streets. Give us a subscribe, like, share, and let's talk about kind of what's going on in the golden sphere. Peachy says, Peachy Homegrown will be all right. We have a bright future. Okay, that was Hybrid said that. Okay. Hybrid, what you are seeking is already in place in South Africa. Go visit. Okay. All right. I'm going to let y'all continue to chop it up in the chat streets. But these are my questions, y'all. These are my questions that we'll explore in other kinds of spaces. I have a question of why, right? Is it just numbers? Is it just scholarship? Is it just increasing interracial marriages? But why do interracial people want their own distinct identity? I think there's YouTube content out there that explains why Black folks are challenging interracial membership racially into Blackness. But I'd love to hear from the voices of the biracial kids. Hybrid says, you can't gatekeep us. We will inform our own, right? He's speaking from agency. He's speaking from self-determination. And I just hope, beautiful, beautiful biracial community, familia, I really just hope it is not a knee-jerk reaction to the negative stereotypes or data sets absent a critical analysis of the beauty and depth and robustness of Blackness, and that it's just not another attack, another assault upon cultural Blackness, and that if there is to be a transition, it can be a baton, it could be a handoff, it can be a generation, because despite what the biracial community becomes, it inevitably has a cultural mother rooted in Blackness. And I know it won't be rigidly distinct, but even something new. I hope it's just not offended, outcasted, or marginalized biracial kids who just couldn't have a sort of source of entry into Blackness, who are seeking alternative. I believe it's more complex than that, but I just don't want a sort of an interracial Black war on YouTube. But I think it's inevitable. And then finally, what do we become? What does the interracial become? As we grow in numbers, it becomes different to create community, cultures, and traditions. The one thing about Blackness in most cultures, they typically have a horrific gathering point that affirms and heightens cultural identity. They have a resiliency in which they overcome it. In the overcome story, they have heroes and sheroes that become their visible pioneers and passion points. They have histories tellers that tell the story, and they continue to fight for healing and resolution from the initial horrific incident. For America, that was the transatlantic slave trade process, X number of centuries of the chattel enslavement, resiliency through Reconstruction and civil rights, and then now we're 50 years in terms of a new identity within an Americanness, where Blackness is continuing to have varying identities, and interracial is also now asserting itself. What does the interracial community become? Beautiful folks. On that note, thank you guys for joining me. Again, tell some folks about us. Love to grow the community. Right now I'm at 235 subscribers. I'd love to get to 250. Y'all help an old man with that. All right. On behalf of 1968 racially Black biracial kids who identify culturally as Black, I'm wide open for the conversation. Golden Sphere, come on in. Love to chop with you. On behalf of J4 Conversations, we out.